Relations between the United States and Russia are at their lowest point in decades. What's causing the rift and what are the major implications? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu and this is The Heat. The state of the relationship between the United States and Russia has rarely been worse. There are major tensions over the war in Syria, where the US has accused Russia of war crimes. Russia has denounced that accusation as, quote, rubbish. The US also accuses Russia of hacking into the Democratic National Committee computers to interfere in the US presidential election, accusations that Russia also denies. Now, with the US about to elect a new president at the beginning of next month, there are serious questions about where the relationship between the two powers goes from here. We begin with correspondent Elena Casas, who joins us from Moscow. And Elena, what is the view in Moscow about the current state of US-Russian relations? Has President Putin or other government officials weighed in on this?
Well, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vitaly Cherkin, said the other day that relations had not been this bad since 1973. And the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, said last week that he believes the tension has reached a dangerous point and both sides need to get back to dialogue. But what we're hearing from the Kremlin doesn't sound very conciliatory at all. President Vladimir Putin has called accusations made by John Kerry that Russia has committed war crimes in Syria Russophobic propaganda, and has essentially said he believes the US is making up allegations of war crimes in Syria in order to make Russia look bad on the world stage. Now, the rhetoric we've seen coming out of Russia has got significantly more confrontational than it was in the past, just in the last couple of weeks. And most analysts say that's down to the conflict in Syria, and particularly the way that Vladimir Putin feels that the US is trying to dictate terms to him in Syria, when, for example, it calls for a no-fly zone in Aleppo which would end Russia's bombing campaign. Russia feels that it's won the right to decide how and when peace will be made in Syria, and it wants the US to respect it as an equal. Putin fears that Washington doesn't take Russia seriously enough, and in the end, many analysts say he'd rather be respected as a threat than not taken seriously enough.
Now, on Sunday, President Putin addressed allegations by the United States that Russia has been involved in hacking into Democratic Party computers, and he also responded to Vice President Biden's threat to retaliate. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Putin has dismissed the hacking allegation as ridiculous, and he also said Biden's threat to retaliate illustrates that the US admits that it does use cyber attacks. The whole question of whether Russia has hacked into the Clinton campaign, though, is something that we've heard quite a lot about on Russian state TV. What we've been hearing is allegations that the whole US voting system is vulnerable to potential cyber attacks. So what analysts say that what's important here isn't necessarily whether Russia could actually influence the US election result by hacking. It's spreading the idea that the US election is vulnerable to this kind of hacking influence, that it is vulnerable to cyber attacks, because that makes the whole US election system look weak. Russia's very sensitive to accusations that it doesn't have a transparent democracy and that the US system is better. And it certainly appears to be trying to create the idea, both among the Russian public and among Americans, that the US system is vulnerable to this kind of hacking.
And what has President Putin said about the prospect for relations between these two countries after the US election?
Well, of course, it depends on who wins the election. Now, Vladimir Putin hasn't expressed any specific preference himself. Donald Trump, of course, has had some positive things to say about Vladimir Putin. He once said that he admired him, and Putin hasn't responded to that by actually saying that he would prefer a Trump victory over Hillary Clinton. But he and Clinton have a long history of animosity. She was Secretary of State 5 years ago when there was a wave of street protests here in Moscow against Putin's government, and he certainly believed that she publicly encouraged them with some things that she said at the time, so that we know that they have a bad relationship. There have been a lot of criticism of Clinton aired on Russian state TV recently. 2/3 of Russians, according to a recent poll, believe that if Clinton is elected, relations between Russia and the US will get worse, whereas only 1 in 5 of them said that about Donald Trump, which isn't to say that Russia's betting on a Trump victory, on Trump winning. I think the Russian government, along with everyone else, is now assuming Clinton Clinton victory is more likely. But what Russia is trying to do, certainly in Syria, is change the facts on the ground so that when a new Clinton administration does take power, her room for maneuver in Syria will be much less than the Obama administration's was, say, a year ago.
Okay, thanks, Elena. That's CCTV correspondent Elena Casas reporting from Moscow. And for more now, joining me here in the studio is Lawrence Korb. He is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He's an expert in U.S. national security issues. He served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense. Also with us from Providence, Rhode Island, is Vladimir Goldstein. He is an Associate Professor of Slavic Studies at Brown University. He's an expert on Russian foreign policy, and also with us here in the studio is Peter Kuznick. He is a history professor at American University and the co-author of The Untold History of the United States. Welcome to all of you to the show. Lawrence Korb, let me start with you. We just heard from our reporter in Moscow about the role that Russia is playing in Syria and the fact that Russia right now is trying to create facts on the ground before a new US president comes into office. How big a factor does the Syrian crisis play into these current tensions between the United States and Russia?
Well, I think it's a very, very big factor because basically it puts the United States and Russia in a potential situation where they could actually have their air forces clash. It also, I think, undermines the United States' efforts to fight ISIS rather than to deal with the Syrian civil war. And again, while this has been going on, Mr. Putin has talked about, well, he's not going to get rid of all of the material that they're supposed to from the nuclear weapons. He's also talked about possible use of nuclear weapons in Europe. So I think the Syria thing is sort of where we're focusing on, but it's part of a much larger picture.
Vladimir, both these countries have worked together on the Syrian crisis. They put together a ceasefire not so long ago. That ceasefire didn't work, but they did work together in putting together that ceasefire. They have a common interest in defeating ISIL. Could you see them actually use this as an opportunity to work together, the Syrian crisis?
I think there is no reason why not. It makes perfect sense for these two countries to work together. And they were moving in this direction. There was a ceasefire, there was an attempt to go on with resolving the issue. But I suspect that it's in the current political situation in the United States, meaning election, dealing with Russia was not in the cards. For some reason, and I would blame Democratic Party for that, the Democratic candidate in particular, they decided to play a Russian card. So Russia has to be presented as a bully, Russia has to be presented as an aggressor, and the United States has to be presented as this knight in shining armor, and which is rescuing the world from this aggressor. And that was more or less the political line of foreign policy which Hillary Clinton advertised, because her opponent, Donald Trump, was talking about, dealing with Russia, making deal with Russia. So had the deal with Russia continued, it basically would play in his favor, because he was saying that we can deal with Russia and we can get mutually beneficial results. So it wasn't in the card. So I think there was this attack on Syrian forces, which then attack on UN envoy, which more or less tore this ceasefire to pieces. Then there was hysterics of in United Nations by United States Representative Samantha Power, and they really bullied Russia into withdrawing from this. However, luckily, sober heads prevail, and it appears to me that again Lavrov and Kerry are talking in Lausanne. So my feeling is that the current leadership with President Obama actually want to make the deal, but we have to consider all these forces within the United States which are betting on Hillary Clinton and don't want this peace to go on.
Right, and Peter, when we look at the broad relationship, the view from Moscow, of course, is very different. Vladimir Putin has said that he doesn't think that these deteriorating relations is solely because of Syria. In fact, he told the Russian state-owned media outlet RT that, do you think our relations with the United States changed because of Syria? No, not because of Syria, but because of the attempts by one side to impose its decisions on the entire world. So to what extent is the US to blame for this?
Well, I would place a lot of the blame on the United States. I think the Americans hold most of the cards. And I think you really have to put it in a context. We can go back very far, but I at least trace it back to post-1990, the agreement that was made about the expansion of NATO. Gorbachev says that they promised him that NATO would not expand one thumb's width to the east. And what has happened since then? NATO has incorporated 12 countries. It's gone up to Russia's border. And even in 2008, George Bush said that got NATO to agree to expand to Ukraine and Georgia. This is a direct security threat to the Russians. So from the Russian standpoint, what they're doing is asserting their national security interests. The United States has a very different idea. If you look back in the 1990s, the United States was able to pretty much walk over Russia. Russia's economy collapsed. It shrunk to the size of the Netherlands during that time. Life expectancy dropped 9 years during that period. The 90s was a terrible period, but with Yeltsin in power, the United States was able to get pretty much anything they wanted from Russia. When Putin took over, he wanted to collaborate with the United States, but he wasn't going to roll over in the same way that Yeltsin had. And so he's asserting Russia's national security interests, which go against America's perceived national security interests. I don't see a real conflict, but if the United States wants to maintain global hegemony in the way that it has, then there is going to be that kind of conflict now.
Lawrence Cole, what do you make of that, the fact that did the United States break a promise when it expanded eastwards, when NATO expanded eastwards, and is Putin now just reasserting Russia's security interests?
Well, there's no doubt about it, and I agree with Peter that particularly when Bush said, we're going to go to Georgia and Ukraine, that was a step too far. I testified against NATO expansion in the 90s. I debated Bob Zellick, who went to work for the second President Bush as trade representative, and then was head of the World Bank. That was. But even having said that, I think it's important to keep in mind when you're talking about Syria. I think what President Putin is trying to do is to divert the attention of the Russian people from the real problems they have at home by trying to play this increased role in the world. And I would suggest that he go back and take a look at what happened to the Soviet Union when they went into Afghanistan. He can prevent Assad from losing, but he can't make them win. And they're spending money that they don't have. The United States has stayed out of the Civil War. We focused on ISIS. We have not gotten involved. And if he doesn't focus on ISIS, that's going to come back and hurt him. Because remember, when Putin came into power, he put down the rebellion in Chechnya. And you have a lot of people from Chechnya coming to join ISIS. And at some point, they're going to go back home if we allow ISIS to continue. Remember, it was a Chechnyan who was there with the Istanbul, bombing. So regardless of, what he brought to office, I think the fact of the matter. And then finally, because of what he's doing in Syria, the European Union has kept the sanctions on him that they put on when he took over Crimea. And by the way, that violated an agreement that the Russians made in 1994 that if Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons, that they would, not go back in and allow their territory to remain whole. So they were wavering on him because those sanctions impact them much more than us. But once he went into Syria and did this horrible things, bombing humanitarian convoys and stuff, they put the sanctions back on. In the long term, that's going to hurt him.
Okay, I want to get back to something else now that we talked about, and that are these allegations that the Russians have hacked Democratic National Committee computers. It's caused deep divisions between the two countries. There's been a back and forth accusations and counter accusations. Russia has dismissed these allegations as rubbish. I mean, how serious is this?
Well, I think this is the new way in which we spy on each other. I'm sure that we're hacked, just like we had spies in the Soviet Union, right. They had them here. I mean, it's a different way of gathering intelligence, and I think you need to be aware. We need to be aware of that. The real question is he doing this to try and impact the American election? I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if they hacked into a lot of things. A lot of people hack into things, and okay. I'm sure we're doing it as well.
Yeah, Vladimir, what do you make of these accusations that Russia's been hacking Democratic Party computers? Yeah, we've not seen any evidence so far that this has happened, and there have been many reports that says that the issues that these hacks have brought up, things like bias in the primary process here in the United States, are not being talked about that attention is being diverted away to the fact that Russia hacked our computers. They're not talking about the substance of what was in these emails.
Well, one thing which has to be stressed, that this is a particular strategy in Democratic Party. There are a lot of problems which, a lot of issues which American voters are facing, economy, sometimes misguided foreign policy. And there are concrete players, from Hillary Clinton, who was in charge of State Department, to, current leadership. And rather than facing them, rather than sort of dealing with the ways they are kind of, encountering these issues, they decided to blame Russia. That is, blaming messenger for a message. And I think it's, the strategy has been practiced by Hillary Clinton for a long time ago. We remember when there was scandal connected with her husband's behavior in the Oval Office, she blamed wide-ranging right-wing conspiracy. So the same thing, there is serious problems, and she came up with a strategy of blaming Russia. And I think it doesn't look very good for the future, because no matter what problems United States will encounter in dealing with China, India, Middle East, it will always be, an excuse. And this excuse cannot work all the time.
Right, Peter, this has got pretty serious, because Vice President Joe Biden has told NBC News that the United States would send a, quote, proportional response to Russia. In fact, NBC also quoted unnamed U.S. intelligence officials as saying that the U.S. is preparing an unprecedented cyber covert action against Russia. All this in the absence of one shred of evidence that Russia is responsible.
In fact, I've spoken to some friends who are experts in this matter, and they say that it's almost impossible to know for sure that Russia was behind this. They say another country can mask it and make it look like it's Russia, and there's been no evidence given at all. But the United States is threatening a response to this. It's a dangerous situation, but it also assumes that Putin is, in my opinion, stupid enough to think that he's better off with Trump in the White House than Clinton. Vladimir Putin, if anything, is not a stupid man. And you look at what Trump represents versus what Clinton represents. Clinton is a hawk. She is taking a hard line toward Russia, as well as other situations. She has been a bit of a warmonger in the past. But Trump is totally reckless, unpredictable. I think Putin can deal with her. But with Trump, if we look, for example, at his the things he said about nuclear weapons, that in itself discredits him, in my opinion. He's called for proliferation of nuclear weapons to Saudi Arabia, to South Korea, to Japan. He said that if we're hit by ISIS, we're going to respond with nuclear weapons. He said, what's the point of having these nuclear weapons if we can't use them? So he wants to make them more usable. I mean, from Putin's standpoint, this is somebody who would be much more dangerous, I think, than Clinton, who is no cup of tea for the Russians. So I would question the basic assumption that he's doing all this in order to get Trump in the White House instead of Clinton.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. Much more on the state of U.S.-Russia relations when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the rift in U.S.-Russia relations. We continue now with our panel. And Lawrence Korb, if you look at this deterioration in relations, we have been here before. There's been the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of course, in the early years of the Reagan administration, President Reagan called the Russians the evil empire. But wasn't the end of the Cold War supposed to bring about a new dynamic in this relationship?
Well, it was, and I think we did have it for quite a while, even if you go back to when President Obama came in and you had Mr. Medvedev running the country, and then Secretary Clinton talked about the reset. We worked together. We got a New START agreement to cut down the number of nuclear weapons. The Russians allowed us to send material to Afghanistan through Russia, so we were working. I think when Mr. Putin came back in, I think he really wanted to restore what he feels is Russia's rightful place in the world. And I think what he is doing right now, he's being more aggressive than he needs to be, basically to divert attention from the problems he have at home. The Russian economy is declining. They're spending money in Syria that they don't, they don't have. And I think at some point they're going to recognize that. President Obama has basically said, you know, our fight is with ISIS. If Assad wants to stay in, you want to keep your base, that's fine. And as I mentioned before, if he doesn't focus on ISIS, in the long term, that's going to hurt him, given the situation that you have in Chechnya.
Vladimir, what do you make of that? Is President Putin being more aggressive than he needs to be, and is he driven by some kind of Russian nationalism to reassert Russia's prominent role in the world?
Well, I think Putin is actually, you know, understands what's going on, and what's going on is Americans' attempt to kind of increase its influence in the world. They do want to have this hegemonic power all over the world, and they're pushing further and further. And the very clear message was sent to Russia in 1999 when the United States bombed Yugoslavia. And Russians will never forget it. It was like a real national trauma that U.S. is pushing them in the areas where they considered, you know, the traditional influence. Then we have war in Georgia. Then we have American attempt to sort of change the government in Ukraine and reorient the Ukraine to such a degree that Ukraine began to talk about joining NATO. So, you know, we have expansion of NATO. We have a bombing of Russia's traditional allies. So, you know, Russians feel that this is, you know, they're being pushed too far. And he had this image, Putin, of a coil which you press too hard, it will push back. And that's what we have. So what have to be stressed, you know, is that that's the thinking will of a lot of Russian people. Putin's policy, you know, enjoys about 80% of, you know, approval rate. So what we have to be aware, even if Putin had wanted to back off from that, there will be a real national kind of, you know, anger, national sort of, you know, turnaround, and there will be a politician who will be 10 times more aggressive. So what I think United States underestimate is how accommodating Putin is. So all this talk about his kind of dreaming of aggression, whatever, it's basically based on nothing. You know, what we see, where we see aggression is NATO expansion, despite the promises not to expand. We have to remember that Russia moved away from Eastern Germany, from Poland, from Czechoslovakia. They moved back, and obviously it's not enough. So a lot of Russian people feel that's too much. And on top of that, what I want to say is the sanctions and the situation of when Russia is under siege is very good for the economy. Russia is turned around. I go to Russia every summer for the research. I take Brown students there, and I observe for the last 15 years, economy improved. Russia is doing actually very, very well. There is a lot of small businesses opening up on every corner. The military-industrial complex is, you know, working full steam. They export stuff. They're now biggest producer of, you know, non-modified, you know, organic products. So this is like a line which has been taken that, you know, Russia economy is falling apart, and the Syria adventure is some kind of way of blindfolding Russian population. This is not true. This is some Russian liberals who sort of come up with this idea that, you know, the country is weak. Maybe that was exactly the situation with Chechnya. Economy was bad, and the war was a way of sidestepping the issues. But this is not the case. And I think Russia will continue to build up on its strength. So I think it's in the interest of the whole world to sort of, you know, to negotiate, to find compromises, and to start treating each other seriously, not like as if Russia is in shambles and the United States can walk all over that and proclaim it dead. Russia is not dead, Putin is not dead, and is actually going to assert itself more and more and more according to its size and its weight. That's right. The take, and that's how Russian people feel.
Peter, did NATO overplay its hand in the late 90s, and is President Putin acting in response to that, to saying, I've got to draw a line somewhere on this? I'm going to draw this line. Was that line Ukraine, actually, when he decided to get involved in Ukraine and say that Ukraine is not going to fall under the influence of NATO?
I think NATO did overplay its hand, has overplayed its hand, is overplaying its hand right now. But the Ukraine crisis had its own causes and its own realities. The Financial Times had a very important article that said that wresting Ukraine away from Russia's orbit was part of a decades-long strategy on the part of the West. And that's the way the Russians saw it. They didn't see, we always talk about the government there as being so pro-Russian. They had made the deal with the EU before they switched back because Russia made them a better offer. So they weren't really, it wasn't really a pro-Russian government, but they, and then they had a deal to get the government out of power, but then there was the coup right after that. So the Russians felt that the people who were involved in the coup were pro-fascist and that their interests were being threatened there. Part of what the United States has not really accepted is that Russia has its own national security interests. And it defines its national security interests in a certain way. And we felt that we can push them as much as we wanted. But as we're saying, the Russians push back. And the Russians have capabilities, especially in that area. And so with the recent NATO exercises and the beefing up of military forces in Poland and in the Baltic states, this is all seen as a threat by Russia.
Lawrence, we're running out of time, but I want to look at personal relationships in sort of big power relations. How important are personal relationships? We know that President Reagan and President Gorbachev had a good relationship. They got things achieved here. There is not a good relationship between President Obama and President Putin.
No, there's not. There was a good relationship with former President Medvedev, but you're right, it has deteriorated. President Yeltsin and President Clinton had good relations, and you're quite right. I mean, I think that that's important if you're going to be able to work together, because we and the Russians have common interests in terms of making sure there's no nuclear proliferation, for example. Both of us are at a point where we might have to spend literally $1 trillion modernizing our nuclear weapons. And with all due respect to Vladimir, I'm sure he sees it different. I'm just looking at the data, which shows that their GDP is declining. So unless the World Bank is wrong, I don't know that. So I do think you can, and with a new administration, there is a chance for that to happen. And I agree with Peter. If they're doing this to get on Trump, I think they're going to be very, very sorry if that happens.
Okay, Vladimir, I've got 20 seconds. Unfortunately, we run out of time. But do you think relations are going to change for the better after the election?
I am sure they will. No matter who wins the White House, they'll decide to deal realistically once they are there, and I think they'll definitely will improve.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com, and we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Send us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page. You'll find that at CCTV America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.